I've always been someone who believed that loyalty and hard work would get you far in life. Growing up, my dad drilled it into me: do your job right, give it your all, and people will respect you for it. It was a simple mantra, but one I carried into adulthood, especially when it came to my career. I had big dreams of climbing the corporate ladder, making my family proud, and, maybe one day, running my own company. That dream felt closer than ever when I landed a job at a fast-growing tech firm 3 years ago. It was a small but ambitious company that had been making waves in the industry. My role as a project manager seemed like the perfect stepping stone to greater things. I remember the day of my interview, sitting across from Brandon, the CEO, in his glass-walled office. He had the kind of confidence that filled the room, the kind that made you want to believe every word he said. "You've got potential," he told me, smiling as he leaned back in his expensive leather chair. "We reward talent here. You put in the work, and I'll make sure you're taken care of. Bonuses, promotions, stock options, you'll see. I look after my people." It was exactly what I wanted to hear. Brandon had this way of making you feel like you were part of something bigger, like you were indispensable to the company's success. It wasn't long before I bought into his vision. I wanted to prove myself, to show that I could make a real impact. So, I threw myself into my work. The first year was a blur of late nights and endless deadlines. My team managed multiple high-stakes projects, pulling in new clients and delivering results that exceeded expectations. Brandon was quick to shower us with praise during team meetings, talking about how we were the backbone of the company's growth. But when it came to actual rewards, well, that was a different story. My first annual bonus was disappointing, to say the least. While others on my team received hefty payouts, mine was a fraction of what I had anticipated. Brandon brushed it off as a calculation error, promising to make it up to me the next time around. I wanted to believe him. After all, mistakes happen, right? But the same thing happened the following year. By then, I had spearheaded some of the company's biggest deals, bringing in millions in revenue. Yet, when the bonuses were handed out, mine was once again noticeably smaller than everyone else's. This time, Brandon didn't even bother with excuses. He simply said, "You're doing great work, but we had to make some tough budget decisions this year. Don't worry, you're on my radar for the next promotion." I didn't want to seem ungrateful, so I kept my mouth shut. But inside, I was furious. How could someone who constantly talked about rewarding talent overlook my contributions? Still, I convinced myself that if I worked harder, if I delivered even more, I'd finally get the recognition I deserved. The tipping point came last December. I had just wrapped up the biggest project of my career, a massive deal with a Fortune 500 client that brought in over $2.5 million for the company. It was the kind of success story that Brandon loved to boast about in industry conferences and LinkedIn posts. I remember the client personally thanking me for my efforts during the final presentation. "You're a rock star," he had said, shaking my hand. "Brandon's lucky to have someone like you on his team." But when the end-of-year bonuses were announced, my name wasn't even on the list. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake. Surely, Brandon wouldn't just ignore everything I'd done for the company. I marched into his office, ready to demand answers. He greeted me with that same practiced smile, the one he used whenever he was about to give bad news. "Look," he began, leaning back in his chair like this was just another routine conversation. "This year's been tough, financially speaking. We had to make some cuts to keep things running smoothly. I hope you'll understand." "Tough?" I shot back, unable to hide the anger in my voice. "I brought in millions for this company, Brandon. How is it that there's no bonus for me, but you're driving around in a brand new Tesla?" His smile faltered for a split second before he recovered. Now, let's not make this personal. This is business. You're a valued member of the team, and I promise I'll make it up to you." I didn't say another word. What was the point? He'd already shown me what my value was. I walked out of his office feeling humiliated, betrayed, and, more than anything, angry. All those late nights, the missed vacations, the weekends spent working instead of being with my family, for what? A pat on the back and empty promises? I went home that night and stared at the ceiling, replaying the conversation in my head over and over again. The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. Brandon had been lying to me from the start. He never intended to reward my hard work. He was using me, and everyone else, for his own gain. And he was getting away with it. But not for long. That night, something in me snapped. I decided I wasn't going to let him get away with it, not this time. If he thought he could cheat me out of what I'd earned, he had another thing coming. I didn't just want my bonus. I wanted justice. I wanted him to feel the same humiliation he had made me feel. And I wasn't going to stop until I made it happen. The first thing I did was start paying closer attention to Brandon's behavior. I noticed how he was always vague about the company's finances, how he avoided questions about budgets during team meetings. I started asking myself questions: where was all the money going? How was he able to afford luxury cars, expensive vacations, and a second home if the company was supposedly tightening its belt? I didn't have answers yet, but I had a feeling I wasn't the only one who'd been cheated. If Brandon had lied to me about the bonuses, who's to say he hadn't done the same to others, or worse? That's when I decided to dig deeper. I had access to company records as part of my role, and I knew how to navigate the system without raising any red flags. Late at night, after everyone else had gone home, I stayed behind in the office, combing through financial reports, expense accounts, and old emails. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for, but I figured that if Brandon was hiding something, it would be in the numbers. What I found was worse than I could have imagined. As the weeks went by, I became consumed with uncovering the truth. At first, I didn't know what to look for, but the deeper I dug into the company's financial records, the more inconsistencies I found. It started small, random charges labeled under vague categories like miscellaneous expenses or consultation fees. But as I pieced everything together, a pattern began to emerge. Brandon wasn't just skimming from the top. He was bleeding the company dry. I discovered that over the past 3 years, hundreds of thousands of dollars had been funneled into private accounts under Brandon's control. Some of it came from slashing employee bonuses, just like he had done to me. Other funds had been rerouted from client reimbursements and company-wide budget cuts. Even the money from a high-profile charity drive we had organized last year had mysteriously vanished, with only a fraction of it going to the actual cause. Every dollar had a paper trail, and I was following it straight to Brandon's bank accounts. It didn't take a genius to figure out what he was doing, using company money to fund his lavish lifestyle while lying to everyone about the state of the business. But the real kicker? He'd been forging signatures to cover his tracks. I found multiple documents that should have been signed by our CFO or the board of directors, but the handwriting matched Brandon's exactly. It was sloppy, desperate, and undeniably fraudulent. I felt a mix of anger and vindication as I stared at the evidence piling up on my computer screen. All this time, Brandon had played the role of the charismatic, visionary leader while secretly robbing us blind. And the worst part? No one had noticed. But now I had the proof. The question was, what was I going to do with it? I could have gone straight to HR or the board of directors, but something told me that wouldn't be enough. Brandon was a master manipulator, and I didn't trust anyone in the company to stand up to him. After all, most of the executives owed their jobs to him. If I made a formal complaint, it might just get buried, or worse, backfire on me. I needed to be smart about this. Careful. Strategic. The first thing I did was make copies of everything I'd found. I backed up the files on an encrypted USB drive and emailed them to a secure, anonymous account I'd set up. Then I printed out hard copies of the most damning documents and locked them in a fireproof safe at home. If Brandon somehow caught wind of what I was doing and tried to delete the evidence, I wanted to make sure I had backups. Next, I started documenting everything he said and did. Every meeting, every email, every casual conversation, I recorded it all. I even started keeping a notebook in my bag to jot down anything suspicious he said in passing. It felt a little paranoid, but I couldn't afford to take any chances. Then, I reached out to someone who could help me take things to the next level, an investigative journalist. Her name was Lisa Carter, and she had a reputation for exposing corporate corruption. I'd seen her work before. She had single-handedly brought down a pharmaceutical company that had been overcharging cancer patients for life-saving medication. If anyone could help me bring Brandon to justice, it was her. I contacted her anonymously at first, using a burner email account. I sent her a brief overview of what I'd found, along with a few pieces of evidence to prove I wasn't bluffing. Within hours, she replied. "This is big," her email read. "But I need more. Can we meet in person?" I hesitated. Meeting her face-to-face would be risky, especially if Brandon found out. But if I wanted to take him down, I needed someone like Lisa on my side. After some back and forth, we agreed to meet at a coffee shop 2 towns over. The day of the meeting, I was a nervous wreck. My heart was pounding as I walked into the cafe, clutching the USB drive like it was a grenade. Lisa was already there, sipping a latte and scrolling through her phone. She looked exactly like she did in her profile picture, sharp-eyed, confident, and no nonsense. "You're the whistleblower?" she asked as I sat down. I nodded, sliding the USB drive across the table. "Everything you need is on there. Financial records, forged documents, emails, it's all there." She plugged the drive into her laptop and spent the next 15 minutes scrolling through the files. Her expression shifted from curiosity to disbelief to something I could only describe as righteous fury. "This is insane," she muttered, shaking her head. "He's not just stealing from the company, he's committing full-blown fraud. And the charity money? That's a PR nightmare waiting to happen." "So, what happens next?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Lisa leaned back in her chair, tapping her fingers on the table. "I'll start putting the story together. But if we're going to make this stick, I'll need more than just the financials. I'll need statements from people inside the company, employees, clients, anyone who can corroborate this." "That's going to be tough," I admitted. "Most of the employees are either too scared to speak out or completely loyal to Brandon." "Then we start with you," she said, her eyes locking onto mine. "Your story is the linchpin. Once the story breaks, others will come forward. They always do." The thought of going public terrified me. If Brandon found out I was behind this, he'd ruin my career, or worse. But I also knew Lisa was right. Someone had to take the first step, and that someone had to be me. We spent the next hour going over the details of my story. I told her everything, how Brandon had promised to reward my hard work, only to cheat me out of my bonuses, how I'd uncovered the embezzlement, and how he'd used his charm to keep everyone else in the dark. Lisa listened intently, taking notes and asking questions. By the time we were done, I felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. "All right," she said, closing her laptop. "I'll start working on this tonight. Once I have a draft, I'll send it to you for review. But be ready, once this goes live, there's no turning back." I nodded, feeling a strange mix of fear and determination. "I'm ready." As I walked out of the cafe, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just crossed a point of no return. For better or worse, Brandon's days of stealing and lying were numbered. I didn't know exactly how this would play out, but one thing was certain, I wasn't backing down. When the article finally went live, it was like setting off a bomb. Lisa had outdone herself. The headline alone was enough to grab anyone's attention: CEO embezzles millions, steals from employees, and fakes charity donations. The piece was meticulously crafted, a brutal takedown of everything Brandon had built his image on. It laid out the financial discrepancies in excruciating detail, citing the documents I had provided. It included damning quotes from Lisa's anonymous whistleblower, which, of course, was me. But the real knockout punch came from Lisa's deep dive into the charity fraud. She had gone beyond what I'd given her and discovered that Brandon had siphoned over $300,000 from what was supposed to go to a nonprofit supporting underprivileged kids. That revelation alone sent shockwaves across the internet. By noon, the story had gone viral. Employees shared it in Slack groups. Clients forwarded it to one another. Investors were calling the office demanding answers. Even rival companies were gleefully circulating the article, eager to watch a competitor implode. Brandon's name was everywhere: Twitter, LinkedIn, Reddit. Memes were popping up with his face photoshopped behind prison bars. The hashtag fraudulent Brandon was trending. I sat at my desk, trying to act normal while chaos erupted around me. Phones were ringing off the hook. People whispered in hushed tones as they stared at their screens. Brandon's office door stayed firmly shut, but through the glass walls, I could see him pacing like a caged animal, his phone pressed to his ear. For once, his charm and confidence weren't going to save him. The fallout was immediate. The board of directors called an emergency meeting that afternoon, and every employee received a terse email instructing them not to speak to the press. Brandon finally emerged from his office just before the meeting, his face pale and drawn. He didn't say a word as he stormed past my desk, but I could feel the tension radiating off him. Part of me was terrified he might suspect I was behind the leak. But another part of me, one I wasn't entirely proud of, felt a thrill of satisfaction. For once, he wasn't in control. I didn't know what would happen in that boardroom, but I had a feeling it wouldn't go well for Brandon. And I was right. The next morning, the company sent out a press release announcing that Brandon had been temporarily relieved of his duties, pending an internal investigation. It was corporate speak for, "We're cutting him loose, but we don't want to admit it yet." But the damage was already done. The SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, had picked up on Lisa's article and announced they were launching a formal investigation into Brandon's financial dealings. Within days, the FBI got involved too, focusing on the forged documents and charity fraud. The entire company was under a microscope, and Brandon was the bullseye. Meanwhile, I kept my head down and continued collecting evidence. I wasn't done with him yet. Lisa's article had sparked a firestorm, but I wanted to make sure Brandon paid for everything he'd done, not just to me, but to everyone he'd exploited. So, I started reaching out to other employees, one by one, to see if they'd be willing to come forward. At first, most of them were hesitant. Brandon had ruled the company with an iron fist, and no one wanted to risk their jobs by speaking out. But as more details emerged in the media, the tide began to turn. People were angry about the bonuses they never received, the layoffs that suddenly seemed unnecessary, and the realization that their hard work had been funding Brandon's extravagant lifestyle. One by one, they started to open up. There was Claire, a senior developer who told me she'd been promised a promotion for 3 years but never got it. "Now I know why," she said bitterly. "The money for my raise probably paid for his yacht." And Marcus, a junior sales rep, who confided that Brandon had pressured him into fudging numbers on a quarterly report. "He told me it was just to make the company look better for investors," Marcus admitted. "I didn't think much of it at the time, but now, God, I feel sick." Then there was Sarah, the office manager, who broke down in tears as she told me about the charity fraud. "I helped organize that event," she said, her voice trembling. "I thought we were doing something good. I can't believe he used us like that." With every new story, my anger grew. Brandon hadn't just stolen money, he had stolen people's trust, their pride, their belief in the company. And for what? A bigger house? A flashier car? It was disgusting. I encouraged everyone I spoke to reach out to Lisa. Some were hesitant, but others agreed, eager to see Brandon face the consequences of his actions. Lisa kept me updated as more sources came forward, each one adding another layer to the case against him. But Brandon wasn't going down without a fight. 2 weeks after the article broke, I noticed something strange. My access to certain files had been revoked. At first, I thought it was part of the company's internal investigation, but then I heard from a coworker that Brandon had been asking around about the leak. He couldn't prove anything yet, but he was clearly looking for someone to blame. I knew I needed to stay one step ahead of him. That's when I decided to take things to the next level. I contacted the SEC directly, offering to provide them with the original files I had uncovered. I wasn't sure if they'd take me seriously, but within a day, I received a call from one of their investigators. "We've been following the case closely," the investigator said. "If you're willing to share what you have, it could be a huge help to our investigation." I didn't hesitate. That evening, I met with the investigator at a neutral location and handed over everything: emails, financial records, forged documents. I even provided a detailed timeline of how I'd uncovered the fraud. "This is incredible," the investigator said as he flipped through the files. "You might have just saved us months of work." Hearing that gave me a sense of relief I hadn't felt in weeks. For the first time, it felt like the walls were truly closing in on Brandon. By the time I got home that night, the story had taken on a life of its own. News outlets were running follow-up pieces, dissecting every aspect of the scandal. Former clients were coming forward with their own complaints, and shareholders were threatening to sue. And then, the moment I'd been waiting for finally arrived. One morning, I walked into the office to find the entire place buzzing with excitement. People were gathered around their phones and computers, whispering and pointing. I didn't even need to ask what was going on, I could see it on their faces. Brandon had been arrested. The image was everywhere: Brandon in handcuffs, being escorted out of his gated mansion by federal agents. His face was a mixture of shock and rage, as if he couldn't believe this was happening to him. For all his scheming and manipulation, he had finally been caught. As I sat down at my desk, I couldn't help but smile. It wasn't just about the bonuses or the money anymore. It was about justice, justice for everyone he'd lied to, cheated, and betrayed. Brandon's empire was crumbling, and I had helped bring it down. Brandon's arrest should have been the end of the story. It should have felt like justice served, a clean conclusion to a messy chapter in my life. But life, as I've come to realize, doesn't work that way. The day after Brandon's arrest, the board of directors held a company-wide meeting. The interim CEO, a quiet and nervous man named Leonard who had always stayed in the background, stood at the podium in the conference room, wringing his hands as he spoke. "First and foremost," he began, "we want to assure everyone that the company will survive this. We're cooperating fully with the authorities, and steps are being taken to ensure nothing like this ever happens again. We appreciate your patience during this difficult time." The room was silent. No one seemed reassured. But then Leonard said something that made my stomach drop. "To rebuild trust, we'll be conducting an internal audit of all employees' access to sensitive files. If you accessed any unauthorized documents in the past year, we strongly encourage you to come forward now. Transparency is key to moving forward." I froze. I knew exactly what this was. Someone on the board, or maybe Leonard himself, had figured out that Brandon's downfall hadn't happened by accident. They were fishing for the whistleblower. I spent the rest of the day in a haze, torn between fear and defiance. On one hand, I knew I'd done the right thing. But on the other, I wasn't naive. Companies like this didn't take kindly to employees who aired their dirty laundry in public. That evening, as I was packing up to leave, I got an email from HR. Subject: Meeting request, confidential. Body: We'd like to speak with you regarding some discrepancies found during the ongoing internal audit. Please report to conference room B tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. My heart sank. They knew. I barely slept that night. My mind raced with worst-case scenarios. Would they fire me? Sue me? Try to discredit me in the industry? By the time my alarm went off, I felt sick to my stomach, but I knew there was no avoiding it. The next morning, I walked into conference room B to find Leonard, the head of HR, and the company's legal counsel waiting for me. Their faces were unreadable, but the tension in the room was palpable. "Have a seat," Leonard said, gesturing to the chair across from him. I sat, folding my hands in my lap to keep them from shaking. "Let's cut to the chase," Leonard said, leaning forward. "We know you've been in contact with the media. And we know you accessed confidential company files without authorization." I opened my mouth to respond, but he held up a hand to stop me. "Before you say anything, understand this: the board has no interest in pursuing legal action against you. Frankly, you did us a favor by exposing Brandon's behavior. But what you did was still a violation of company policy, and we can't ignore that." I nodded, swallowing hard. "I understand. We're offering you a choice," Leonard continued. "You can resign quietly, effective immediately, and we'll provide you with a severance package. Or, if you refuse, we'll have to terminate your employment without severance and make a note in your record that could follow you in this industry." It wasn't a choice at all. I signed the resignation papers later that day. They gave me a check for 3 months' salary, made me sign a non-disclosure agreement, and escorted me out of the building like a criminal. But even as I walked out of the office for the last time, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. A week later, I found out why. I was scrolling through the news on my phone when a new article about the scandal caught my eye. It wasn't about Brandon this time, it was about the company itself. The headline read, "Whistleblower exposes corruption, but is the board hiding something bigger?" My stomach clenched as I clicked on the link. The article was written by a different journalist, not Lisa, but it built on her original piece. It claimed that multiple sources inside the company had come forward with allegations of misconduct, not just by Brandon, but by the board of directors as well. According to the article, Brandon hadn't acted alone. The board had approved many of the financial transactions he'd been arrested for. They had known about the missing charity money, the slashed bonuses, the forged documents, and they had turned a blind eye because they were benefiting from it, too. The kicker: Leonard, the interim CEO, had been one of Brandon's closest allies. My mind reeled as I read the details. It all made sense now. The board hadn't fired Brandon out of outrage or morality. They had thrown him under the bus to save themselves. And my resignation? That had been part of their damage control. By getting rid of me, the whistleblower, they could tie up any loose ends and keep the focus on Brandon. I felt a surge of anger unlike anything I'd ever felt before. I had risked everything to expose Brandon, and now the very people who had enabled him were getting away with it. But if they thought I was done, they were dead wrong. I immediately reached out to Lisa, sending her a secure message through the encrypted email account I'd used before. "You're going to want to see this," I wrote, attaching the new article and everything I hadn't already given her, the full extent of the board's involvement, the internal emails I'd found, even the details of my forced resignation. Lisa responded within minutes. "Let's blow this wide open," she wrote. The second story hit like an earthquake. This time, it wasn't just Brandon under scrutiny, it was the entire leadership team. Shareholders demanded a full investigation. Employees staged a walkout, refusing to return to work until the entire board stepped down. Clients canceled contracts. The company's stock price plummeted. Within a month, the company declared bankruptcy. The board members, including Leonard, were named in multiple lawsuits. As for me, I became something of a hero in the industry. Word spread that I had been the whistleblower behind both scandals, and people admired my courage for standing up to corruption, even at great personal cost. A few months later, I was offered a job at a competitor, this time, a company with a reputation for integrity. But the real satisfaction came when I saw Brandon again, this time on the news. He had agreed to a plea deal, naming the board as co-conspirators in exchange for a lighter sentence. The smug, untouchable man who had once cheated me out of a bonus was now just another disgraced executive in an orange jumpsuit. Justice had been served. And for the first time in years, I finally felt free.